You really thought you'd be seated with us? Sweetheart, this table is for people who actually matter. Go find somewhere in the back. You're embarrassing yourself. My mother-in-law said that loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. The private dining room at Canoe went perfectly silent. 43 people, my husband's family, his business partners, the partners' wives, all stopped mid-conversation and turned to look at me standing in the doorway, still wearing my coat, still holding the gift I had driven 4 hours to bring. My husband looked at his plate. I had just landed 40 minutes earlier at Billy Bishop. I had flown in from Vancouver on what my husband told his family was a last-minute government thing that kept her away all week. The government thing was a classified federal cybersecurity review I had been leading for 11 days. Sleeping 4 hours a night in a secure facility on the edge of the city, trying to close a gap in the national infrastructure grid before someone else found it first. Nobody at that table knew that. To them, I was the quiet wife who worked some vague federal job in Ottawa and never talked about it. My mother-in-law had decided years ago that I was a low-level bureaucrat who filed reports nobody read, and she had built an entire mythology around that idea. The mythology was comfortable for everyone. It kept me small. It kept her son looking like the obvious success in the family. I pulled out the chair at the far end of the table, the one beside the waiter's station, the one nobody wanted, and sat down without a word. She smiled at that. That specific smile she had, the one that said she had won something. If you have ever sat in a room full of people who have decided you are nothing and stayed quiet to protect someone who never once protected you, please stay with me, because what I am about to tell you is the story of the last time I ever did that. My husband Thomas came from old Ontario money, not the quiet, private kind, the loud, logo-visible kind. His mother, Annette, wore it like armor. She wore it at Christmas dinner and at church, and at the private fundraising galas she organized for the hospital foundation she chaired. She wore it like a second skin, and everything that threatened the look of that skin had to be managed, contained, or quietly removed. I had been managed for 6 years. I met Thomas at a conference in Halifax 8 years ago, when I was finishing a contract with the communications security establishment. I was 31. He was a corporate lawyer with a warm handshake and a genuine laugh, and a mother he described as particular. I thought I understood what particular meant. I did not. Our first Christmas together, she handed everyone at the table a wrapped gift from Holt Renfrew. She handed me a Canadian Tire gift card for $25. She said, "I wasn't sure what you'd need." She said it in front of 7 people. Thomas laughed it off. I smiled and said, "Thank you." That was the first time I understood the rules of that house. The rules were simple. Thomas was the achievement. I was the accessory that had not yet been approved. No matter what I did in my professional life, no matter what clearance I held or what problems I was trusted to solve, the version of me that existed inside Annette's world was the woman who had married above herself and should be grateful for the opportunity. Thomas knew this. He had always known this. He dealt with it the way he dealt with most difficult things. He looked at his plate. In the 4 years between that Christmas and the night at Canoe, I had accepted more than I should have. I had arrived at family dinners to find my seat moved to the corner without explanation. I had listened to Annette describe my job to her friends as something in computers, very entry-level. I had nodded when she told guests that Thomas had really come into his own since finding stability. The word stability delivered with the specific weight of a woman who meant me, but would never say so directly. I had sat across the table from his sister Claudette, who had once leaned over at Thanksgiving and said quietly, "You know he married you because you seemed easy, not difficult. He gets enough of difficult at work." She had said it like a gift, like honesty, like she was doing me a favor. I had not told any of them what I actually did for a living. That was deliberate, and that decision was not mine alone to make. The nature of my work required discretion. My director at the Cyber Center had a specific phrase for what happened when federal security professionals started talking freely about their roles at family dinners. He called it a human intelligence problem we don't want. So I kept it vague. Federal contractor, policy and infrastructure, nothing exciting. The nothing exciting part was technically the largest lie I told on a regular basis. But here's what I had also done in those 4 years that nobody in that restaurant knew about. When Thomas's sister's husband lost his company in 2021, and they were 3 months behind on their mortgage in Oakville, it was a quiet call from me that connected him with the right private lender and guaranteed the bridge financing. I never told anyone it was me. Thomas thought it had come through a mutual contact. When Annette's charitable foundation hit a compliance issue with the CRA that threatened its registered status, it was a phone call from me to a former colleague, in a position to advise them quietly, that made the problem disappear before it became public. When Thomas's brother, Duncan, needed security clearance for a federal supply contract and his application was being delayed, it was a 2-line email from me to someone I had worked with for a decade that untangled it in 72 hours. Duncan thought it was luck. He told Thomas he had finally caught a break. I had been catching breaks for all of them for 4 years, quietly, invisibly, through channels they did not know existed and would not have understood if I tried to explain them. I did it because Thomas loved his family, and I loved Thomas, and I had genuinely believed for a long time that the gap between who I was and who they thought I was would close on its own. That eventually Annette would see something. That eventually the distance would shrink. The gap had not closed. On the night of Canoe, this past March, a dinner Annette had organized to celebrate Duncan's 40th birthday, and more accurately, to introduce Thomas's family to 3 of Duncan's new business partners from Bay Street. I arrived late because my flight had been delayed, and I came straight from the airport. I had been in Vancouver all week on the infrastructure review. I had barely slept. I was wearing the same blazer I had traveled in, and my hair was not what Annette would have considered appropriate for Canoe. She spotted that immediately. She spotted the blazer, the carry-on I had left with the coat check, the slight tiredness around my eyes. She processed all of it in about 2 seconds flat, and then she said what she said, loudly, in front of 43 people, at a restaurant where the tasting menu was $350 a head. I sat at the far end of the table and did not eat much. The waiter kept looking at me like he was trying to figure out what had happened. I drank water and watched Thomas laugh at his brother's jokes from 6 seats away and told myself that tonight was not the night. Not here. After the main course, one of Duncan's Bay Street partners leaned over to me. He introduced himself as Hartley, and he was the kind of person who asked what you did for a living, the way most people asked what the weather was like, reflexively, filling space. Before I could answer, Annette cut in from 3 seats down. She did it without looking up from her dessert. She works in federal government, administrative, very process-oriented work. Not terribly exciting for dinner conversation. She said the last sentence like a favor, like she was sparing me. Hartley nodded politely and turned back to Duncan. Thomas looked at his plate. I excused myself and went to the washroom. I stood at the sink for approximately 90 seconds, hands flat on the cool marble, and made a decision. Not about tonight, not about the restaurant, about everything. The flight back to Ottawa was on Wednesday. On Thursday morning, I sat in my director's office on the 3rd floor of the Cyber Center building in Canada, and I told him I was ready to adjust my disclosure posture with my immediate family. He reviewed the relevant considerations. He said the decision was mine. He said the standard guidance was straightforward. Discretion in professional contexts, personal life at personal discretion. He reminded me of the specific protocols that would still apply regardless of what I chose to share personally. I signed the relevant acknowledgement form. On Saturday, Thomas's family had a birthday brunch in Burlington for his aunt. It was a small thing, 14 people, his mother's generation mostly, a few cousins. I drove down alone. Thomas was meeting me there. I wore my service ID lanyard tucked inside my collar because old habit, and I brought the kind of quiet, settled feeling that comes from having already decided something. Annette was already there when I arrived. She was standing in the front hallway of her sister-in-law's home, telling someone a story, wearing a silk blouse the color of cream, and when she saw me come through the door, she did the thing she always did. That small pause, that visual survey from head to toe, that microscopic rearrangement of expression that translated to, "Not quite right, but what can you do?" "Thomas isn't here yet," she said. "Not hello, not good to see you. Just the information that the person who mattered had not arrived yet." I smiled. "I know, I drove separately." She turned back to her story. I found a seat in the living room next to Thomas's aunt, who was turning 74 and was genuinely kind and had always treated me like a human being. We talked about her garden. We talked about a novel she was reading. It was a peaceful 20 minutes. Then Annette called the room to attention for a small toast. She talked about family. She talked about the importance of people who show up consistently, who invest in the people they love, who build things that last. She looked at Duncan while she said this. She looked at Claudette. She looked at Thomas's aunt, who was the birthday guest. Her gaze moved around the room in a careful orbit that excluded me so precisely, it could only have been deliberate. She finished the toast. People raised their glasses. Her sister-in-law's husband, a retired engineer named Gerald who had always been friendly to me, leaned over quietly and asked what I had been working on lately. He meant it genuinely, he always asked. Before I could answer, Annette said from across the room, "Oh, she does something with federal paperwork. We never quite understand it." She laughed lightly. Other people laughed lightly. That specific social laugh that isn't about anything being funny. I set down my glass. "Actually," I said, "I'm the Deputy Director of Cyber Threat Operations at the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity." The room did not go silent immediately. It took about 2 seconds for the words to land, and then it did. Annette's expression did something complicated. The cream-colored certainty she wore slipped, just slightly, the way ice shifts before it breaks. "I've been in this role for 3 years," I continued. keeping my voice level and completely conversational, as though I were discussing the weather. Before that, I was a senior analyst with the communications security establishment. I hold a top-secret clearance with special operational access. Last week, I was in Vancouver leading a federal infrastructure security review. The week before that, I was in a classified briefing with the deputy minister. Gerald said, "Good Lord." Someone in the back of the room said, "Wait, seriously?" Annette opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Why on earth would you never say anything?" "I was told the work was too boring to bring up at dinner," I said. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The drive home from Burlington took about an hour. I called my director from the car and told him the disclosure had gone smoothly. He asked if I felt better. I told him I thought I was about to. He said that was probably the right answer. Thomas called me that evening. He had heard from his mother. His voice had a quality I recognized. The voice of a man who had spent his whole life managing the space between two things and had just realized the space had run out. He said, "Why didn't you just tell me you were going to do that?" I said, "I've been telling you for 6 years that it was a problem, Thomas. You kept looking at your plate." He was quiet for a long time. What happened in the weeks after that was not the clean movie version. There was no airport scene with soldiers, no mother collapsing on marble floors. That is not how things actually end in real life. And I want to tell you the truth of it, rather than something tidier. What happened was this. Duncan called me 2 days later. He said he had done some research, which meant he had Googled my name and the role I had described, and he had found a government directory listing and a 2022 CBC article about the center that quoted me once briefly about national infrastructure resilience. His voice was different on the phone, careful in a new way. He said he had not known. I said I was aware of that. He said he wanted to understand. I told him there was not much to understand. I had a job I could not fully discuss. I had been asked to keep it quiet in social contexts, and I had done that, and his family had filled the silence with their own assumptions and had been comfortable enough with those assumptions that nobody had thought to check. He did not have an answer for that. Annette called me 4 days after the brunch. She did not apologize exactly. What she did was call and speak for 11 minutes about how she had always believed in giving people privacy, and how she had never meant to make me feel unwelcome, and how family was complicated, and how she hoped we could move forward. It was the kind of call a skilled person makes when they have realized they have been caught doing something, but cannot bring themselves to name the thing they were caught doing. I listened to all 11 minutes. When she finished, I said, "I appreciate you calling, Annette." I said nothing else. I let the silence sit there. She said, "Well, I suppose we'll see you at Easter then." I said, "I'll check my schedule." I had not been to a family dinner since. Not because I was cutting anyone off in some dramatic public gesture, but because I had quietly decided that I would no longer arrange my life around the comfort of people who had spent 6 years deciding what I was worth before they thought to ask. Thomas and I were working through what that meant for us. That part was private, and it was complicated, and it was ours. But here is what I want to tell you, because this is the part that actually matters. On the last night of the Vancouver review, I stood on the roof access level of the facility we had been working from and looked out over the harbor. The file was closed. The vulnerability was patched. The critical infrastructure serving somewhere in the range of 400,000 people across 3 provinces was no longer exposed. Most of those people were asleep. None of them would ever know there had been a problem. That is exactly how this work is supposed to go. I thought about the dining room at Canoe. I thought about Annette's voice saying not terribly exciting for dinner conversation. I thought about 6 years of sitting in the chair nobody wanted next to the waiter's station, while the people at the other end of the table discussed their own importance. I had spent 6 years making myself small inside someone else's story about who I was. I had done it out of loyalty to Thomas, out of respect for work that asked me to stay invisible, out of a complicated hope that the gap would eventually close by itself. And the entire time, the woman standing at the waiter's station had a portfolio on her desk that they would not have believed. I did not say this to be angry. I've said it because I think about all the women I know who are doing some version of the same thing. Sitting in the chair nobody wanted. Staying quiet so something else is protected. Being assessed by people who have not asked one real question. The harbor was dark and cold, and completely beautiful. I went back inside. I had a debrief call in 40 minutes and a flight home in the morning. The version of me that had driven to family dinners hoping to be seen had not survived that flight to Vancouver. What came back was someone who already knew her own weight and did not need it confirmed by anyone at a private dining table. You do not have to make yourself a headline to matter. But you also do not have to keep sitting at the end of the table next to the waiter's station while someone who has never asked a real question about your life describes you as entry-level to her friends. That chair is now empty. It can stay that way.